Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 1, an introduction to world history. In this podcast, I want to first give a quick overview of what world history actually is. So a little bit of the philosophy behind the course, and then in the second half of the podcast, I'm going to get into some of the course content that corresponds with the readings and documentary that you're going to be reading and watching this week. In the second part of the podcast, I'm going to talk about early hunting and gathering societies, the transition to agriculture, and how this transition to agriculture led to the emergence of the very first civilizations. So why do we study world history? Not that long ago, history courses were exclusively organized into specific civilizations or nations. So in Canada, for example, students might study a version of Canadian history and maybe Western civilization. But over the past few decades, there have been some big changes in the world that have really challenged historians to think about history in a different way. So what are some of these big changes? Well, the first big change is a little bit older than a few decades, but still relatively recent in the long scope of world history, and that is the two world wars of the 20th century. World War I and World War II were horrific, and they're both perfect examples of what can happen when nationalism, or an intense pride in one's own nationality and culture, goes unchecked. When assessing the wars, historians determined that it was really this intense nationalism that was a major cause of both World War I and World War II, and historians felt that in order to curb these ultra-nationalist sentiments, a true history of the world was required. The belief among many historians was that people would be better global citizens if they had a better understanding of the world's peoples, a more balanced understanding of the world's history, as opposed to a version of history that puts one nation or culture above all others. So historians went to work crafting a narrative that can explain the history of the world in a manageable way. The second big change is globalization. As technology becomes more and more advanced, people around the world become more and more connected. Countries don't exist in isolation today. A policy decision made in the United States or made by China affects the entire world. New tools of communication let us see what's happening around the world, whether it be in Libya or Haiti or Pakistan. Information travels very quickly. As the world becomes more connected, our problems are also more connected. Today, the world's biggest problems are global problems. The economy, environmental degradation, disease, terrorism. All these problems affect the entire world. They don't stop at national boundaries. And a third big change is the emergence of new countries in the developing world. 100 years ago, almost the entire world was controlled by a dozen or so countries and their colonial empires. Today, there are about 200 countries in the world, and these countries are asserting themselves on the world stage and demanding that their histories be counted as well. So we really have this explosion of new knowledge about histories that weren't really explored before. Histories of peoples of Asia and Africa and America before European contact. And these histories are important to understanding how the world continues to develop. So, in short, the world history movement has tried to create a global understanding of the human experience that highlights the broad patterns that have tied the world's civilizations together throughout history, while at the same time acknowledging the unique histories of individual peoples. No world history course can cover everything, and historians often debate what criteria should be used for deciding what to include and what to leave out. So, despite endless debates on exactly what to include, most historians agree on three major issues or three major questions that define the field of study of world history and that help us address the problems of understanding the past. These three major issues are called the three C's: comparison, connection, and change. So the first C is comparison. World history is a comparative discipline. Throughout the course, we'll try to identify the similarities and the differences in the experiences of people from different parts of the world. Was the experience of women largely the same across all societies? What did the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty, which existed roughly the same time, have in common? How were they different? What did the 20th century communist revolutions in Russia and China have in common? How were they different? So, describing and, if possible, explaining these differences and similarities is one of the major things a historian should be able to do. The second C is connection. Connection means the interactions and encounters among different people. What happens when distinct civilizations come into contact with each other? Focusing on the interactions between cultures really fights the urge of thinking about peoples or civilizations as self-contained and isolated communities. Because in reality, the world's peoples or civilizations have always been connected. Our world's cultures never emerged in isolation from one another. The Chinese, for example, invented technologies that spread across Asia and Europe. They passed elements of their culture to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And the Chinese themselves absorbed Buddhism, which was a religion that was foreign to China. Buddhism started in India and spread to China. Christianity started in the Middle East and spread to Europe, then later America. So these connections among different societies have spread technologies, ideas, religion, crops, writing, diseases across the globe, and this cross-cultural interaction has really been one of the most powerful drivers of change in world history. And this brings us to our final C, which is change. Historians are always concerned with what changes, what stays the same, and why. In world history, historians are usually most concerned with big picture changes, the changes that have an impact on a large segment of the world's population. How did the transition from a gathering and hunting economy to one based on agriculture take place? How did cities, empires, and civilizations take shape in various parts of the world? But world historians also pay attention to the changes that occur within and between specific civilizations. How can we explain the dramatic collapse of the Maya or the fall of the Roman Empire? How did Buddhism change when it entered China? How is Islam transformed when it encountered West African societies? At the same time, historians also have to be aware that although some things change, some things stay the same, and we can't let changes blind us to the continuities of the human experience. China has existed for more than 2,000 years. Slavery persists even today. There are more slaves today than any other point in human history. Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam have endured for centuries. So we'll use these three C's, comparisons, connections, and changes, to try and bring some unity and coherence to the vastness that is world history.